If you look back over the careers of our favourite movie stars, even the very best with unbelievable runs of films are all going to have at least one or two questionable choices within their repertoire. In retrospect, it's likely that most Hollywood stars had the odd turkey early in their career, a film that absolutely bombed at the box office which they would rather forget they were a part of. Some actors will have had movies which made money but compromised their artistic integrity, and on occasion they may have been contractually obliged to return to a franchise or convinced against their better judgment with money just too good to turn down for a follow-up to a great picture, when their heart wasn't in it or the script just couldn't hold a candle to its predecessor. There are occasions when it was apparent from day one on set, or even before shooting started, that the chemistry was all wrong and the creative partnership was going to quickly hit a downward spiral. And so with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with 10 actors who knew their action movies were doomed from day one.
Want to stay safe online and save big? Get up to 76% off a 2-year NordVPN plan, plus 4 months free and up to a $50 Amazon gift card. Just scan the QR code or click the link in the description and it's all yours.
Number 10. Michael Caine, Jaws: The Revenge. When Steven Spielberg directed Jaws, he changed the face of the blockbuster monster movie by supplying one of the highest grossing pictures of all time, which can still be considered a masterpiece to this day. It's a film which probably did not need any sequels, yet its success was always going to determine otherwise. As with many franchises, it's fair to say that in the case of Jaws, each movie slowly diminished in terms of quality, culminating in Jaws: The Revenge, which featured iconic British acting veteran Sir Michael Caine in a chief supporting role. The movie was widely panned and signalled the nail in the coffin for the Jaws series, with its far-fetched storyline of a shark seeking revenge against the family of the first two films' protagonist. This was a strange supernatural element to add to the story, which must have appeared slightly bizarre at the script reading stage. But at this middling point in his career, it seems Michael Caine was willing to take whatever roles came his way and offered a decent paycheck. Whilst looking back at his involvement during an appearance on the Jonathan Ross show, Caine explained, "Somebody said, 'Have you ever seen Jaws 4?' I said, 'No, but I've seen the house it brought for my mum. It's fantastic.' He added, 'The bleeding shark didn't even work on that. I thought we were in trouble when the shark didn't work.'" Number 9. Dolph Lungren, Masters of the Universe. In the mid-80s, He-Man was one of the most popular children's toys on the market, and Masters of the Universe was the ultra-cheesy movie adaptation created to follow on from the success of the tie-in cartoon series. The film tapped into the popular sword and sorcery fantasy movies of the time, along with sci-fi action inspired by the likes of The Terminator and space fantasy in the vein of Star Wars. Dolph Lundgren was hired to play Masters of the Universe's lead role of He-Man, but was a relative novice at the time, having only appeared in 2 previous movies, a supporting role in James Bond's A View to a Kill, and his breakthrough appearance as Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. Dolph certainly had reservations about taking on the He-Man character and the impact that playing such a role would have on his career, and he also reportedly felt the pressure of carrying the movie during challenging shoots in a costume that left little to the imagination. In a 2014 interview with Yahoo, Lundgren noted, "It was weird playing a toy. In those days, comic strip characters were not looked at as big movie franchises. They were like little offshoots that people did, you know? Masters of the Universe, although looked back on with fondness from a certain point of view by many these days, ultimately crashed and burned at the box office, with Lundgren seemingly proven right about how he imagined the film was going to be perceived." Number 8. Peter Weller, RoboCop 2. Paul Verhoeven delivered one of the great sci-fi action films of the 80s when he served up the ultra-violent story of RoboCop, the murdered police officer who is brought back to protect and serve as a part human, part cyborg super cop. Verhoeven's style was unquestionably key in creating one of the most successful R-rated genre films of its time. But the director, who would go on to create the likes of Total Recall and Starship Troopers, had no inclination to return to the character, despite the success prompting the studio to press ahead with plans for a sequel. Peter Weller was the face of RoboCop, and despite his reservations when he found out that Verhoeven would not be involved, was ultimately convinced to return for RoboCop 2. The film tried to capture the tone of Verhoeven's classic, but in less capable hands, it ultimately was poorly executed in comparison. Despite introducing a few new neat sci-fi ideas, RoboCop 2 featured some dodgy-looking special effects and a pretty boring plot. Weller has since conveyed his disappointment at how the movie panned out, and at the time, executing a problematic Frank Miller script put the nail in the coffin for his involvement with the character, as he failed to return for RoboCop 3. A wise decision in hindsight. Number 7. Jaime Lee Curtis, Halloween Resurrection. Jaime Lee Curtis stepped out of the shadows shadows of her movie star parents when she starred in John Carpenter's seminal slasher Halloween. Curtis returned for the sequel in 1980 before eventually leaving the horror genre behind and forging a highly successful mainstream career in movies such as A Fish Called Wanda and James Cameron's True Lies. However, she was persuaded to return to her role as Laurie Strode for the rebooted Halloween H2O, assuming that it would be a final climax to the series, which would end after she decapitated horror icon Michael Myers at the end of the film. Far from that, the success of the movie would see the studio making other plans, and Jaime Lee soon realized that H2O was just to be another film in an endless franchise. A far-fetched script was put together to explain how Myers had escaped and that it was actually an innocent man who was beheaded in the H2O finale. Curtis agreed to come back for Halloween Resurrection, but insisted that she was paid a lot of money and that Laurie would be killed off in the opening sequence to give the fans closure on the character's storyline. The studio obliged and delivered a movie which did just that, before moving on to a completely separate story barring no relevance to the Laurie Strode scenes, making everyone wonder why they had even bothered to include the character in the first place. Number 6. JeanClaude Van Dam, Street Fighter. Street Fighter 2 had been a monumentally successful video game in arcades and consoles in the early 90s, and it was inevitable that it would end up on the screen in one form or another. But turning a simplistic story about a fighting tournament with a cast of colourful characters into a successful film would turn out to be easier said than done, as this cartoonish mess of an action movie would prove when it eventually hit cinemas in 1994. JeanClaude Van Damme's star power at the time was brought in to carry the movie as lead character Colonel Guile, and with the hope that the picture would appeal to his large fan base of martial arts movie fans. But it appears from the get-go that JeanClaude was there for the money alone, as he put in a lackluster performance throughout, delivering on the corny script with little passion for the project in a wooden performance that is overly noticeable even for his standards. Director Steven D'Souza would later refer to the filming of the movie as a total show, also remarking to The Guardian that Van Damme was coked out of his mind throughout the shoot. Despite not seemingly taking the job seriously, Van Damme certainly seemed to enjoy himself on set, highlighted by reports of his diva-like behaviour throughout, drug and alcohol intake, and the fact that he has also gone on record as admitting to having had an affair with co-star Kylie Minogue whilst on set. Number 5. David Harbour, Hellboy. When Guillermo del Toro brought Mike Mignola's cult demonic comic book series to the screen with his version of Hellboy, he created an almost perfect visual representation of the character and his world. He followed this up with Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, which was widely considered to be an even better movie, with both films showcasing the Hellboy story in emphatic fashion, and with lead actor Ron Perlman making the character his own. It was rumoured that Del Toro would be returning to complete a trilogy of Hellboy movies, but sadly this wasn't to be for the visionary Mexican director. Instead, bringing the demonic hero back was trusted into the hands of Neil Marshall, and hot on the heels of his acclaimed role in Netflix's Stranger Things, David Harbour was chosen to fill Perlman's giant red boots. However, visually and story-wise, the film failed to match the standards set from Del Toro's two films, and failed dismally at the box office. During the filming process, it would seem that Harbour could see that the writing was on the wall, and even took to Instagram Live to note, Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman created this iconic thing that we thought could be reinvented. I think it failed before we began shooting, because I think that people didn't want us to make the movie. It was a very difficult experience because I wanted a lot out of it. Number 4. Sean Connery, Highlander 2: The Quickening. Highlander was a highly original movie when released, blending modern-day sci-fi with the medieval, in a tale of immortal warriors transcending time and fighting each other by sword until only one remains. Christopher Lambert starred as Connor MacLeod in his first US feature film, but it was the star power of Sean Connery that helped to put bums in seats with his supporting role as Mentor Ramirez. The film became a cult classic, and plans for a sequel were set in motion, with Lambert keen to reprise his involvement, but with Connery seeming not too bothered about returning to a role he appeared to have little admiration for at this stage in his career. The producers were reluctant to press ahead with Highlander 2: The Quickening without Connery appearing, and a lot of work was undertaken in order to persuade the former James Bond star to sign on. He had demanded numerous script rewrites take place, as well as a lofty reported salary of $3 million in exchange for 2 weeks filming, while during production the crew were also forced to bend over backwards in accommodating the star. Connery's character appears in more screen time in The Quickening, but the expense to get him there, as well as a whole host of other production problems, saw the movie's budget well exceed its return, and it is generally considered to be one of the weakest action sequels of the era. Number 3. Sylvester Stallone, Judge Dredd. Sylvester Stallone was one of the biggest action movie stars in the world when he joined the Judge Dredd project. Hollywood was looking for its next big crossover hit following the success of the Tim Burton Batman films, and the mid-90s was a time long before the phenomenon of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. universe, when the modern comic book movie genre was still trying to find its feet. The filming and production of Judge Dredd was fraught with problems, with Stallone reportedly unhappy with the final script and director Danny Cannon's overall vision. Sly would use his star power and enormous ego to flex his muscles and use his clout to exert his own ideas onto how the film should play out. He wanted to take it in more of a comedic and cartoonish style than had first been planned, and the conflict between star and director would pull the film into different directions, which was all too apparent when the final cut was delivered to audiences. Stallone himself has gone on record as referring to the outcome of the film as being a wasted opportunity, telling Total Film, "The biggest mistake I ever made was with the sloppy handling of Judge Dredd." The legendary star appears to have always regretted the way the experience turned out, with the conflict between star and director ultimately dooming the presentation rather than enhancing it. Number 2. Sigourney Weaver, Alien Resurrection. Ridley Scott's Alien is one of the key movies in the sci-fi horror subgenre, and a near-perfect execution in filmmaking which also introduced an iconic heroine in Sigourney Weaver's Lieutenant Ellen Ripley. She would of course reprise the role in that rare occasion when James Cameron's Aliens more than equaled the iconic feats of the first movie. But then came Alien 3, a film that in the opening credits completely undid the fans' investment in the satisfying finale of Alien's surviving characters, which then threw Ripley into a storyline that compared to the first two films was rather boring, with a dismally dark visual tone and use of early CGI which hasn't aged particularly well. Sigourney Weaver believed the franchise had run its course following the negative response to that film, and with a seemingly irreversible conclusion to her character's arc. But a script for a further movie soon surfaced, and a desire from the studio to revisit the story by bringing Ripley back from the dead. Weaver initially stood her ground, feeling strongly that there was absolutely no reason for her to return. However, after meeting with scriptwriter Joss Whedon, she eventually agreed to reprise Ripley after all, and despite her reservations about Resurrection being one movie too many for the series, a reported $11 million salary and a co-production credit was ultimately enough to persuade her otherwise. Number 1. George Clooney, Batman and Robin. Sandwiched between Tim Burton's first two entries in bringing DC's Caped Crusader to the silver screen and Christopher Nolan's famed Dark Knight trilogy, director Joel Schumacher produced two overtly camp and colourful Batman movies, which after achieving box office success with Batman Forever, then hit rock bottom with the universally considered awful Batman and Robin. Schumacher's first Batman, Val Kilmer, had decided that one comic book movie was enough, and so a new lead was sought for Batman and Robin, with the director eventually settling on George Clooney. At this time, Clooney was riding high and transitioning from TV to cinema after putting in a highly memorable performance in the Robert Rodriguez-Quentin Tarantino vampire flick From Dusk Till Dawn. Clooney has often looked back on the role, which was widely ridiculed, admitting that he had reservations about taking on the iconic hero, and that in hindsight, it physically hurts to watch his own terrible performance in a film which turned into a car crash of a movie with a highly questionable style over substance. Although his involvement did little to dampen his hugely successful career in movies, this seems as if it's one performance that George Clooney would certainly like to brush under the carpet.